Welcome everyone to our final legislative update for 2022. I want to thank our sponsors, the League of Women Voters for Bloomington, Monroe County, also the League of Women Voters for Brown County, and the Brown County Chamber of Commerce, as well as the Greater Bloomington Chamber of Commerce. We are so glad to have them as our sponsors, and we welcome you and to our legislators who were able to be with us today, Matt Pierce and Shelley Yoder. My name is Sonia Learcamp, and I'm going to be your moderator today. I am co-vice president of the Brown County League of Women Voters, and it is my honor and privilege to be able to moderate this interaction with our two legislators. I'm going to ask everyone who is a participant to mute your audio while I give some directions and kind of point out today's agenda. And each one of you who participate in this forum will have an opportunity to ask the legislators questions, and we'll give you the instructions for being able to do that as well. Legislators will have an opportunity to give both opening remarks and a few closing remarks. So I think we're ready for the next slide. And okay. First of all, with reference to any questions that are going to be asked of Senator Yoder and Representative Pierce, you will put in the chat a message to the question moderator indicating your desire to ask a question. Questions will be put in a queue in the order received, and at the appropriate time that your question is being addressed, the moderator will ask you to unmute your speaker so that you can personally ask the question. You will be given 1 minute to ask your question, and the timer will sound at 10 seconds. By the way, this is being recorded by Community Access Television. And by unmuting and talking on this update, you are giving your permission to be recorded. All legislators will be given the opportunity to answer each question. This is an informative session, not a debate. And as in previous updates, we expect everyone to be civil and respectful to the legislators and to each other. And that has not been a problem in the past, and I don't expect it to be a problem today. So next slide, please. The legislators will each have 2 minutes to answer a question. A timer will sound at 10 seconds, and the order of answering the questions will rotate from Representative Pierce to Senator Yoder and then back again. I think that now we are ready to start with opening remarks. And excuse me, Senator Yoder, if you are prepared, we'd like to start with you.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here and to have an opportunity to reflect on the session for 2022 and to hear your questions and have an opportunity to respond to them. I will say right now, I do have to hop off. I'm early. I'm going to leave at 10:30. Our Senator Greg Taylor's father died this week, and I'm in the car driving to the funeral. And so our thoughts and prayers are with him and his family during this time. As I was preparing for this morning, I was thinking, what are the highs and what are the lows from the 2022 session? And I highlighted some. I'll start with the lows and we'll end on the highs. Of course, what's now House Enroll Act 1296, which is the permitless carry bill. Governor Holcomb did sign that into law. And unfortunately, last year, I could see the writing on the wall, so to speak. I noticed that we made way in the budget to not have any cost to filing a permit to carry a firearm. And that was a signal that perhaps this session we would be seeing a permitless carry bill be filed, and we did, and it did pass. And we fought hard I appreciate everyone's work in trying to slow that down. Law enforcement was against this bill, but unfortunately it did pass out of the General Assembly, and Governor Holcomb did sign that into law. Another low was the anti-trans bill that really made into to use a metaphor, sort of a political football out of vulnerable people, and that is young people, trans people, and forbidding trans girls from participating in sports between the ages of kindergarten age to 12th grade. And the governor, it did pass out of the General Assembly, but the governor did veto that bill because, as what we've been saying all along, there is no proof that there is a problem. And I appreciated him vetoing that bill, but we have heard that we will be coming back into session to do some technical changes, and that they will be presenting a veto override bill along with that. So that's disheartening. Another low was, speaking of political footballs, was what is now House Enrolled Act 1001. And the piece of this that was, to me, a real low was, it was a political football to discuss food benefits. Of what the governor wanted in this language was to make sure that the SNAP benefits that were tied to the health emergency with the federal language, that the state language would allow for those who qualified to receive the emergency benefits in SNAP, our food stamps, so to speak, we call them SNAP benefits, that those would be tied to the federal language. So if the federal health emergency continued, those who qualified for the SNAP benefits could continue receiving those. And it became a political football. It became this conversation about just this piece of it. The bill did so much more, but it became clear that, once again, vulnerable people who look to these SNAP benefits to provide food for themselves and their families, what that conversation became was a conversation about, well, we have made it too easy for people to not go back to work. That if we remove these benefits, then it will create an incentive to go back to work. So misguided. And to me, that was a real low point in much of that debate around that bill. And I was sad to see putting vulnerable people in such an unfortunate debate. And that was a low point for me. High points, I think the collaborative and relentless efforts at defeating Senate Bill 167 and 1134. We had meeting the League of Women Voters legislative update about 1134. And to see, and I'm going to add Senate Bill 17. So these bills were really about classroom censorship, and to see the rallying around them. And it wasn't just school teachers, and it wasn't just parents of school-aged children. That we had people opposing these bills from the business community, from faith communities, from civic organizations, and the way in which all of these individuals came together across the state and fought to defeat these bills down to the letter. I mean, making sure that none of these aspects of the bills would successfully make it into amended language, and to see all of them defeated was a real high point in this legislative session. I would also say the changes in Indiana code on what is the definition of rape, that successfully made it through, and those are positive changes for Indiana. And finally, some positive in maternal health. Last session, we funded changes to maternal health coverage for those recipients on Medicaid from 12 weeks to 12 months, a full year. We made that change in the budget, and this year we made the change in Indiana code, and those are positive. That's a high for Indiana. So those are my highs and those are my lows. And for me, it's just an overview of the 2022 session in some sound bites, but I'm excited to see my colleague, Matt Pierce here, and I'll hand it over to him.
Thank you so much, Senator Yoder. Representative Pierce, we'll go to you now.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. So, for me, I think the most interesting thing about this last session is what didn't happen, what didn't pass, particularly when you look at what was happening in the beginning of the session and then how it kind of played out. And so, Shelley mentioned the fact that House Bill 1134 and these kind of political bills that got started by this idea of critical race theory somehow poisoning our kids' minds and kind of morphing into this general idea that teachers are involved in some kind of unwholesome indoctrination in our schools, and we've got to get them under control and give parents abilities to sue and do all kinds of things to put an end to it, which really was a ridiculous premise. But I guess within the primary voting base of the Republican Party had some salience that really thought could drive some votes for them. Because I mentioned in a previous meeting, at least on the House side, where all members are up, and the Senate only half of the members are up. But in the House side, you have a concerted effort on the part of more conservative members to try to take out the less conservative members. So you have a little bit of a civil war going on within the Republican caucus. And so I think that the leadership of the House decided they needed to have a lot of really conservative red meat to feed to the primary voters. Otherwise, they might not make it out the other side. And we'll find out in May how that all comes out. And so I think that's what was really driving a lot of things coming out of the House. And so it's interesting to me that you had that bill, the anti kind of vaccine bill, the anti-emergency order bill. You remember that started out in the, I guess it was December, where the House said, we're going to come in for this special one-day session and pass this thing out. And it's a high priority. You got to act now. And then they figured out they didn't really have the votes. So then they pulled the plug on that. And they said, we'll do it first thing in January when we get back. And they passed it out. By the time it got through the other end, through the Senate, it was pretty much just a lackluster bill. You did have the controversy over the SNAP benefits, but in the end of the day, what it pretty much just did is said, okay, administrations, you can, you have authority to seek these additional funds from the federal government for the most part that are tied to COVID emergency orders. And then it just pretty much codified federal law about when you can seek an exemption from a vaccine mandate that your employer might put in place, which was a far cry from the original bill, which essentially would have allowed anyone to just write down on a piece of paper, I object, I have a religious objection, and then the employer would have to accept that no matter what. So that bill ended up, not being very significant at the end of the day. And another bill that got a hearing in the House and the Elections Committee would have required people running for school board to list their party affiliation. They wanted to kind of create partisan school board elections. And not a single person testified in favor of the bill in committee. So that must have caused people to think twice because that bill didn't move out of committee. So that was another thing that didn't happen. A piece of this whole kind of school censorship thing going on was, in the current code, we have a definition of matter harmful to minors, which pretty much mirrors a court definition of obscenity. And within that statute, it says that essentially people running libraries and, schools and public libraries, university libraries, that they have a defense. So if they have things in their collection that people might consider harmful to minors, they have a defense to that because, libraries have big holdings and you have a diverse number of users and things. And so there was an effort to strip that away for public libraries and school libraries. And at the very end of the last day, the last minutes of the session, this conference report popped up which would have stripped away that defense. And it passed the House. So there's a whole bunch of stuff shoved into this bill. And then in the Senate, oddly enough, the person whose job it was to explain the conference report just got up and made some kind of, joking description of the bill in 1 or 2 sentences and sat down thinking, of course, this thing's going to pass, and it ended up being defeated. So that was another big, another example of this kind of red meat agenda, as I call it, that didn't make it through in the end. So what you saw was a lot of the, not all of them, but a lot of these kind of cultural bills that came out of the House ended up getting kind of ground up over in the Senate. But the way the Senate was dealing with this stuff was so sloppy. It was almost like they couldn't quite make up their mind what they wanted to do. And so the gun bill is a classic example on the permits. So they had this big long committee hearing. Then the committee chair decided to basically kind of gut the bill down to not much of anything, which happened. Then it went over to the Rules Committee, where usually bills go to die, but for whatever reason, timing or whatever, it didn't get out of there. Then we get to conference committee time, and clearly the Senate is making an effort to resurrect the bill. And so they have one bill they decided to strip out and put it into, and then they switched to another bill that they would strip out and put the provision in there. And so that conference report has to get approved by the Rules Committee before it can be voted upon. And, my understanding from just reading accounts of it is the bill is actually defeated in the Rules Committee, but before they officially tallied the vote, they took one member aside and convinced that person to change their vote so the bill could continue to move. And then you had a lot of debate on the Senate floor. So that was a very odd twisting and turning kind of approach and just very sloppy. And I for the life of me, I can't understand why the Senate leadership just couldn't decide what they wanted to do on that bill and then just do it. So it makes me think that there is a lot of kind of struggle going on in the background somewhere on that particular bill. Another thing that the House passed, which thankfully went by the boards over in the Senate, were further limitations on voting absentee by mail. You might remember there was a House provision which would say that not only would you have to attest that you would be unavailable to vote in person on election day, but that you would also be unavailable to vote absentee in person early on any of the early voting days. And, that was really designed to just, severely limit any kind of voting by mail. And so fortunately, that provision went by the boards. So those are examples of things that I think were bad policies that did not become law. And so that was a good thing. On the other hand, there are lots of things, and I'm sure Shelley has her list, that didn't become law either. So for the Democrats, our agenda for this House session, for this legislative session in the House, was to try to address the real challenges that Hoosier families face every day. And so we wanted to get something done on paid and family medical leave to make that available. We wanted to address higher education costs, either by helping reduce people's student loan debt or finding a way to reduce overall the cost of college for higher education. We wanted to try to do more on prescription drug costs, try to get those costs down. We have a real crisis in availability and affordability of childcare, getting pre-K going. We got all this money in the Treasury, and yet we're not willing to help families who are struggling with childcare. That's something else we want to do. On the renewable energy side of it, we have a real problem with the net metering law, which deals with how people get compensated who have solar panels on their roofs and they feed excess power into the grid. We're kind of going to go off a cliff on that based on some legislation that was passed 4 or 5 years ago, and that really needs to be corrected. And so none of that got done, which is a problem. And I'll just end here because I think I'm probably running out of time for my 10 minutes, but the tax cut bill, I think, really kind of summarizes the difference between the parties and just the whole approach to the thing. So we got another round of tax cuts, and at the end of the day, they're going to benefit most wealthier Hoosiers and corporations. And, just one example, they eliminated the utility receipts tax, right? So these are taxes on our utility bills. And people are really struggling with high utility costs right now. So I can see how you would want to do that, because why do you want to tax necessities? So, I kind of agree with that general policy. The interesting thing, though, is, the average kind of homeowner energy user, they're going to save maybe $2 or $3 a month with that. So that's something. But who it's really going to benefit are the heavy industrial manufacturing users of electricity. They're going to save tens of thousands of dollars from that provision. So really, that's more about helping industrial energy users than actually helping, residential people, although it will get played out in the coming election as something that is for residential users. And the fact that we have a flat income tax, not a graduated income tax system, means that when you cut some percentage of the income tax, it's going to benefit the higher income earners just because it's, a flat tax across the board. So what the Democrats are saying is like, okay, if you're really hell bent on cutting taxes, let's target the tax cuts to the people who need the most help. And one classic example right now is just these gas prices are out of control. And, we could help out a little bit on that by suspending the gas tax and then using this extra money, the surplus that's building up, to backfill that. So we can ensure we can continue our infrastructure and road programs while at the same time knocking maybe 50 cents a gallon off the price of gas. So that's just one example. And there are a lot of other things. We could increase tax credits for people paying for childcare. There's all kinds of things we could do within the tax code that would actually directly help those who are struggling the most in this current economy with inflation and other things we're facing. So there's more I could say about the tax cuts, and maybe I'll work on it later, but I think I should probably stop now.
Representative Pierce, thank you so much for your insight into what didn't happen. And I think now that we are prepared to start accepting questions, and I hope that everyone will go into the chat and indicate their desire to ask a question. I'll ask the question moderator if we have someone ready to pose a question at this time.
We have 3 questions in the queue. First up is Karen Renbeck. Karen, please unmute and ask your question.
Thank you both for being here. My name is Karen Renbeck. I'm a public defender here in Monroe County. So I was hoping you could talk about what new laws have passed concerning changes to the criminal code or the courts. Thank you.
And first to go answer this question would be Representative Pierce.
Yeah, on the criminal code side, it's a little bit of a mixed bag. So I think the most encouraging news is we did pass, and we've been doing this for a couple sessions now, some pretty good legislation to attempt to reform the juvenile justice program and really try to get these kids who are having trouble, they're ending up in the criminal justice system and not really getting the help they need to get at the underlying problems that they're facing. And so we passed legislation that's really designed to reorient the system, to assess what's happening with the child. And if they're not a danger to themselves or others, let's get them into a setting that's really going to be able to actually give them some treatment and try to get to the underlying thing, really treating them more like, a child in need of services than some kind of criminal. So that was a really important thing. The reverse side of that, which I thought was not the best, is, in Marion County, they had a big controversy over charitable organizations that help people pay their bail, right? Because I think you heard me mention before in these meetings that I think about 70% of the people who are in jail are actually just awaiting trial and they can't afford bail to get out of there. So a large part of our jail overcrowding is caused by this issue. And, both the courts and the legislators said we should be using, basically instruments to kind of analyze who's a flight risk, who's a danger to the public and who's not, and do the best we can to get people who aren't out of jail. And so we had a bill that did pass that puts limitations on these charitable organizations that are trying to help people be able to afford their bail. And I said on the House floor that really a vote for that bill is a vote for a two-tiered system of justice. And so that was kind of the downside on the world.
Thank you, Representative Pierce. And Senator Yoder, are you able to respond?
Yes.
Okay.
Representative Pierce did such a good job giving an overview. I would just sort of fill in a few things. One area didn't go as far as what I would have liked to see, but we did create some eviction expungement a little bit. And we definitely need more work there. But when we're trying to address housing accessibility. Evictions, not all evictions are created equal. And that, what you could call a scarlet E on your record, can keep you from being able to find housing. And oftentimes these eviction
No, so I don't
marks on your record are the result of the individual not knowing or not doing anything to remove it. Like there were provisions to get them off of your record, but Hoosiers just aren't given the information on how to do that, or it's too complicated, or it's unclear. And hopefully in this session, we paved a way, found a path forward for these individuals that brings us to a more equitable way of addressing evictions and evictions on people's records. So I thought that was positive. And I would just note the amount of time that was spent this session. I heard it often that we couldn't deal with many of the issues, many of the priorities, especially the Democrats were pushing, because it was a short session. We spent so much time addressing Marion County and not issues that were really facing all of Indiana. And that was a real missed opportunity. But those were a little bit of the details that I wanted to add to Representative Pierce's response.
Thank you so much, Senator Yoder. Could the question moderator please indicate who is next in the queue?
Kathleen Bogus is next, and we have two more in the queue. Kathleen, thank you.
Yes, Matt addressed the net metering issue, but Shelley and Matt, Daryl and I are wondering, what can we voters do this year to increase the probability of having hearings and votes on climate change and renewable energy in the next legislative session?
Thank you, Kathleen. Senator Yoder, would you like to address this question first?
Thank you, Kathleen. Yes, I know that I've received a verbal agreement and commitment from Senator Cook to at least look at community solar during the interim session, that we can further study this and come up with recommendations for the next session. And we can do this study in the 21st Century Energy Task Force. That I filed a bill for community solar. I worked with the NAACP. I worked with Hoosier Action Coalition, Citizen Action Coalition, Hoosier Environmental Council, to come up with really good language on community solar. It did not get a hearing, but I did get a commitment from Senator Cook. So I am hopeful that we'll be able to study that. I also filed a bill for the net metering, addressing net metering. And to answer your specific question, I would say, what can we learn from how we were able to really make some noise with House Bill 1134 and House Bill 167? I think beginning to find economic reasons and getting our business community to engage.
Okay. We're having some technical difficulties hearing you, Shelley.
Fair enough. I will just say, keep up the work, encourage people to reach out to their legislators across the state asking for this, because they are conservative values. We want everyone to be able to know how much energy they're using and how they can save money on their energy bills. Thank you.
Thank you. Representative Pierce.
Yeah, I think it's, the bottom line is you have to, do that grassroots networking, and you have to have the Republican members hearing from their people, right? The Democrats, our constituencies in Bloomington, I hear loud and clear from people who are concerned about climate change and want better renewable energy policies. And so, we're for the most part on board, but what has to change is more Republicans have to be hearing from their own constituents who have rooftop solar, who would like to do it, or just concerned about the very evident impacts of climate change. And that's how it's going to change. I do think that I've concluded that really attempting to get the General Assembly to actually say in a resolution or something, climate change is real and we should do something about it, is really not the best use of your energy, because you can see things evolving, but the Republicans are never going to stand up and say, we got to do something about climate change. We got to deal with this. I think that they no longer kind of declare it's a hoax. Their attitude kind of is like, well, all this renewable stuff is happening. The energy mix is changing. The feds are doing stuff. And so I guess we better see if we need to realign some of our policies here in Indiana just to at least deal with this transition that's coming, whether we as a state like it or not. That seems to be their attitude. And so you don't really have this energy to say, oh, we have to embrace zero carbon energy as quickly as possible. Now, the funny thing is when they do something they're declaring is addressing the issue, it's usually the wrong thing. So right now we have this small modular reactor nuclear bill that passed. And so we now have on the books that if you're a utility, you can come in and ask for one of these really expensive small nuclear reactors to be put in to create energy. And then they get like triple the profit. They get paid for construction before the thing actually even provides any energy. So that's an example going the wrong direction.
Thank you very much. Would the question moderate? Yes, thank you.
Next up is Tommy Allison, and then we only have one more in the queue. So if people want to ask a question, please put your question or your name to the question moderator. Tommy Allison, please unmute and ask your question.
Go ahead and ask your question.
My question is regarding the fact that gerrymandering has given us so many safe districts and a supermajority, which means that legislators don't have to listen to their constituents. And what bothers me is that the common good issues, as Yoder and Pierce have stated, get sidelined. And so we have serious issues such as the COVID deaths in the nursing homes and the passing of the gun control in spite of the overwhelming saying, no, we need registration of guns. So I think that Yoder has already figured out some ways to get around it and got some extension of the maternal care and her idea of going to the economic reasons for some of these terrible situations. But do you have other ideas how to deal with this problem?
Representative Pierce, I think it's your turn to go first.
Well, there obviously needs to be a long-term strategy to try to get us out of this gerrymandering loop by the time in a decade when this is due to happen again. And that's just going to take a lot of grassroots effort. And again, at the end of the day, you're going to have Republicans basically saying, Republican constituents essentially saying, yeah, I'm conservative. Yeah, I like it when my team wins. But, for fairness and the strength of democracy, we need to have more competitive and fair districts. And that's at the point when I think things will change. So we have to figure out how to kind of build bridges to the other side, which might like the Republican supermajorities, and figure out how we can get them to look at the bigger picture of the impacts on democracy. And, it's just every year things kind of erode just a little bit more. So like I noticed this year that, when you get into conference committees under the rules, if the minority member of the conference committee refuses to sign a conference report, they can just be removed by the majority, and then a majority member can be put on who's willing to sign. And so that in the old days, that would get used on these really high profile bills. So like the gun permit bill, constitutional carry as they call it, that would be a situation where, it's likely the Democrats would sign a conference report on that bill and they would remove you because that was like one of their big things they had to get done. On a lot of the other issues, though, they would kind of force the members to have to work with the minority party to get to a compromise so that everybody could sign the report. And sometimes bills just wouldn't become law because they didn't have the signatures. Well, now what's happened is you just are presented with a conference report as a fait accompli. and they walk away, and you're given a certain period of time before they just remove you. And so there's really not negotiation occurring in the ways they have in the past.
Thank you, Representative Pierce. Senator Yoder, would you like to address that question?
Yeah, thank you, Mayor Allison. I don't have great signal. Can you hear me okay?
We can right now, yes.
Okay. I wish so much I could say this is the solution, but I at this point don't know. But I do know that what we are seeing with infighting of the supermajority, my hope is, and I do hear from constituents, or I hear from my colleagues who have constituents, that the infighting, that is what
I'm sorry, you're kind of going
so that in and of itself is directly related to this gerrymandering problem. And all that we can do to continue to talk about redistricting independent commissions, to not give up on that, to continue to convince county by county to adopt such a measure like Monroe County did, perhaps that can make a difference in what the General Assembly will do. So if we can make inroads county by county, perhaps that can make a difference in what we see at the State House.
Okay, thank you very much, Senator Yoder. And do we have anyone else in the queue?
We have 3 questions in the queue. Next up is Jim Borman. Jim, please unmute.
Good morning. I have a quick question for you. I have been following and did follow the gun law that passed, and saw that the police were adamantly opposed to it. And it kind of boggles my mind about how the legislature decided that it was important to pass a law to make it easier to get guns, at least from the outside. I don't know a lot about guns and so forth. So could you please explain what this law does and why it passed, irregardless of the police being against it? Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. This question goes first to Senator Yoder.
What this new law, which I think is 1296, the permitless carry. So if a gun shop owner, they still have to conduct a background check, but the purchaser does not have to apply for a permit to carry the firearm. The person can still choose to file for a permit, because that would permit that person to be able to cross state lines and continue to carry, because other states continue to have a requirement of needing to have a permit. So if an individual in Indiana wants to permitless carry, that would not permit them to carry outside of Indiana if they're going into a permit state. So some may choose, but it will be voluntary. But now anyone over the age of 18 can walk into a gun shop, a background check will be conducted, and based on that outcome, an individual could buy a firearm right then and there. And it is shocking that Indiana would pass such legislation when all law enforcement bodies were saying, please do not pass this legislation. They were opposed. The governor was opposed. And so I was pretty surprised that the governor did not veto, although we had seen red flags that this was going to pass this session, because we made a provision in the budget last year to allow this to happen. So that's kind of a little bit of an overview, and I'll let Representative Pierce fill in the voids.
Thank you, Senator Yoder. Representative Pierce.
And the bill really doesn't have anything to do with buying and selling guns. I mean, there's a tangential relationship there. But, essentially, once you have a weapon, when you buy the weapon, you don't need any permits or anything to have the weapon at home. And I think, in fact, the law, I still check this, but I think that if you carry the weapon openly, like Wild West style, like on a gun belt, I think that you can wander around all you want. And that, so the question was, when you want to conceal a weapon, so when you want to have the weapon, hidden under your jacket, or you want to have it in the glove compartment of your car, you want to have this weapon outside your home in a way that people don't know you have it. That was where, under the previous law, you had to get a permit. And in order to get that permit, you had to be fingerprinted to prove your identity, and then a background check was done, because in Indiana, the law says if you're a convicted felon, you are not allowed to carry a concealed weapon. So the problem is, now that we've eliminated this requirement that you have to have a permit to carry this concealed weapon out in public, now when the police encounter a vehicle, and this is often what happens, and somebody's got a gun in that vehicle, in the current system, the system that's being faded out, the police officer, when they do that standard check, it's a registration, who's the driver's license, all that kind of stuff, they get told as part of the BMV information whether or not the person has a permit to carry a concealed weapon. So now they know the person they're dealing with the weapon in the vehicle, is not a convicted felon and has legally a right to carry that gun. Now what's going to happen is that information will not be available. So what the police testified is that when they approach a vehicle, somebody has a gun in there, they have no way to know whether that person's a convicted felon illegally carrying the weapon, or whether they're actually, legally able to do that. And they said that in their system, they're not allowed to go in and check someone's criminal history unless they already believe a crime has been committed. There has to be what they call a predicate crime. So what this essentially means is the police will be encountering a lot of convicted felons with weapons, and they're just going to say, have a nice day, because they'll have no idea they're not allowed to do that. So what does that mean? In Bloomington, where we have these kind of drive-by shootings starting to happen and different things, when police encounter people, unless they have reason to believe that that was the person who actually was involved in immediate crime, they're just going to have to let them keep their weapon.
And thank you so much, Representative Pierce. I know you went over a little bit, but I think that topic required it. So thank you. Do we have another question in the queue?
Yes, next up is Bruce Jaffe, and then we have two more in the queue.
Thank you. Bruce, would you unmute and ask your question, please?
Thank you very much. I wish, could we have a little discussion of the politics involved in the cut in the vaping tax that was 25%, and now it's going to be 15%? What is the politics involved, obviously, in a smoking-related bill?
Thank you very much for that question. And Representative Pierce, I think you're up first.
Yeah, to be honest with you, I don't know what's happening in the background on that. I mean, the argument was that they set the tax, which, by the way, hadn't gone into effect yet. It wasn't scheduled to go into effect until July. Proponents of that said that they'd concluded that they'd set it too high, that they wanted the vaping taxes to be roughly equivalent to the good old-fashioned tobacco taxes. And so the argument was they needed to cut that. But of course, there's really no addressing of the public health question of, do you want to make vaping more affordable, particularly for kids? Because the one thing you have to kind of understand, when vaping first arrived on the scene, and then the legislature decided it needed to have some legislation around vaping, the vaping industry convinced the legislature that vaping was a wonderful breakthrough because people who have had trouble quitting regular cigarettes could switch to vaping. They would consume less carcinogens in the system, and they could kind of taper off and eventually not be smoking at all. And so vaping was this great thing that would be this big advancement in public health. Well, what we saw with Juul and these other things is that, no, this is like a complete gateway with these candy flavored vapes, and the kids are vaping like crazy in school. They're getting really high amounts of nicotine, even higher than you get from cigarettes. And so it's been a complete disaster. But the legislature is not willing to admit that and say, we really need to discourage vaping. just as much as we discourage tobacco smoking. Instead, it's like, well, vaping's an emerging industry and we got to be pro-business and help these shops, make their money. We don't want to overtax them. That seems to be the attitude.
Thank you so much for that response, Representative Pierce. And Senator Yoder, do you have anything to add to that?
I would just add that Representative Pierce really touched on a real concern that lowering this tax on vaping among how it impacts our young people. And we're seeing record high incidents of mental health, anxiety, suicide, and suicide attempts among young people. And the addiction that happens with vaping, it does increase anxiety. And so making vaping materials and equipment more accessible is the opposite direction of what we want, of where we want to go.
Yeah, we're having a little trouble hearing you, Shelley.
Like Representative Pierce said, I could not straight answer why we were doing this. And well, I apologize for that. The only answer I could get about this from the author or from the Senate side was, well, we made it possible last year in the budget, so we're just fixing it with code. And I think that's just bad policy for Indiana.
Well, I think we also have one of the lowest cigarette taxes in the United States. So those health concerns don't seem to be a real priority. The next question in the queue, please.
Next up is Brad Swain, and we have one more after Brad. Brad, please unmute and ask your question.
Hi, I'm the reluctant operator of a local mental health facility. And I'm hearing rumblings with our lobbyists that Representative Steuerwald might be doing a comprehensive or a deep dive into mental health. Can either of you share what you know what those plans may be?
Thank you very much, Brad. And Senator Yoder, I think that you're first up this time.
And I have 4 bars, so that's pretty exciting. This is an incredibly important topic, and I have not heard what Representative Steuerwald is considering. I know that I've been working alongside Senator Kreider, who on the Senate side has been working on these issues for quite some time, but I have not heard the specifics of what Representative Steuerwald is considering. I know that finally issues of mental health among everyone, but in particular even our youth, that they're getting more attention. And I'm looking forward to this next budget cycle that we can really put some money behind it. I was hoping that we could have a conversation instead of looking at tax refunds to Hoosiers around. We would be really talking about how can we get Hoosiers some access to substance use disorders, a treatment, and mental health treatment. That to me was a better use of our funds, some of our reserves that would benefit Indiana in a bigger way than the tax refund that we ended up passing.
Thank you very, very much. Representative Pierce.
I think that what might be happening is you might recall that the governor announced the formation of this kind of public health task force study committee kind of thing he was doing on his own. And I think he said in the State of the State address this year that next year's session, he wanted to be kind of the public health, mental health session. So I think that there is some anticipation that the governor will push onto the agenda actually figuring out how to deliver public health services and particularly mental health services across the state. And of course, that really goes hand in glove with the challenges that our local jails have been facing with so many people suffering from mental health illness. while they're incarcerated. And so I think that's the thought, maybe like, well, okay, if we're actually going to have a big bill talking about how we deliver mental health services better across the state outside the criminal justice system, that's our opportunity then to kind of plug the criminal justice side into that and hopefully have facilities available where people can get treatment without having to be going through the criminal justice system to get what little might be available.
Thank you very much for that response. Ms. Moderator, do we have another question in the queue?
The next up is Pete Lenzen, and then we have one more after Pete. So Pete, please unmute and ask your question.
Thank you. I appreciate you having this session on a Saturday when a lot of us are more available than during the week, including the legislatures. And my question is, the issue of large corporate gifts to legislative leaders appears to be almost invisible to the majority of the citizen population. Although the Indy Star has done a couple of articles on this a couple years ago that were very insightful. This issue, again, of corporate gifts to legislative leaders seem to be particularly relevant in the utility opposition to the rooftop solar and net metering discussions, but there have been others as well. My question is, how can citizens obtain information on these gifts provided to the legislative members? And secondly, is this a big part of their, how significant is this? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pete. And that question goes first to Representative Pierce.
And the answer is it's very difficult. And I know the people in this meeting trying to overturn Citizens United will have a lot to say about this. But, we have a system now, thanks to the Supreme Court, where we have all this dark money sloshing around the system. So if someone makes a contribution directly to a legislator, that has to be put on the campaign finance report, and you can look at that. You can see where money's coming from legislators. If money's giving directly to a legislative caucus, they also have to file their reports and kind of see where the money comes in from them. And then you've got this situation where corporations can give money to a 501c4 organization like the Chamber of Commerce, State Chamber of Commerce, and then the State Chamber can turn around and donate that money. And so there's like a built-in money laundering system. So you can't really tell where the heck the thing comes from. Another thing that happens too is you can give a giant contribution to the say National Republican Governors Association. The Democrats have one too. And then that money can be turned around and funneled into the Indiana governor's race. And so what happens is these people, these corporations who want to influence the system, they just work through these dark money organizations. And it's very difficult to know where things are actually coming in. But, really this campaign finance structure is the large sums of money are raised by the legislative caucuses. And then that money gets parceled out to the members in the targeted races where they think that it's needed. And so, the House Republicans might be raising, $3 million a cycle, and it's coming in from all over the place. And there have been many times where I've sat there in my chair watching some bill getting voted on. I thought to myself, this is kind of like a return on investment for some big donor, but I can't figure out any way to prove it.
All right. Senator Yoder, would you like to address that question?
Yeah, thank you, Pete. I think what is even more alarming and what became front and center this session and what we're reminded of is, they use this, we're a part-time legislature. And so the assumption is we'll have other jobs. And what we were reminded of is sometimes those other jobs are in direct conflict to the legislation that they are voting on and pushing. And Speaker Houston, being, a six-figure, I think it was almost a $500,000 salaried employee of the College Board, pushing House bill or voting in favor of it, 1134. And that is just one example of, that's not necessarily a donation, but is certainly a conflict of interest. And I serve on the ethics committee, and we don't meet. And when we met one time this session, and the ethics in question, the violation in question, was such a non-issue. It wasn't even close to, I was trying to, when they announced that we were meeting, because there was a case or a possible violation. I mean, I had in my mind all of these possibilities that we could be hearing. And when we get in there and we hear it, it's just a lost opportunity to be having these conversations. So I think the issue is even more complex, just even more so than just contributions to campaigns. It's also employment.
Thank you very much, both of you, for the answers to that question. Do we have another question in the queue?
This is the last question in the queue. So if anybody else has a question, next up is Penny Githens. Penny, please unmute and ask your question.
Thank you. I, like everyone else, I want to thank Senator Yoder and Representative Pierce for being with us and giving us their time. There have been recently settlements from some of the opioid makers and pushers, and I don't know how else to refer to them, but how will that money be spent, and how much control will the legislature have over the spending of the opioid settlements? Thank you.
What am I supposed to ask?
Before I call on one of the representatives, Tommy and Jim, can you mute your microphone, please? Thank you. I believe the first one to answer this question would be Senator Yoder.
Thank you, Commissioner Githens, on your question. I'm not sure exactly how that will play out. I don't know. I don't know, maybe Representative Pierce knows, maybe he can look it up. I'm not sure how that will be determined. If I was thinking that when, and I thought when the local municipalities and local governments received the settlement money, there would be oversight from the fiscal and executive bodies of local communities. But I'm sure that the state will receive a settlement amount, but how that money will be spent, I'm not sure at this point. Representative Pierce, are you sure? Do you know?
Yeah, I'm trying. House Bill 1193 dealt with this opioid litigation and extended the time for people to opt in. And my understanding is a lot of local units of government didn't want to opt in because they were concerned they really weren't going to see the money, that most of it went to the state. And so I'm just trying to look in this summary. It says, reduces the percentage of opioid litigation settlement funds distributed for use of statewide treatment, education, and prevention programs for opioid use disorder, provides that 35% of opioid litigation settlement funds are to be distributed to cities, counties, and towns for programs for treatment, prevention, and care that are best practices for opioid use disorder. And so basically you've got to opt in. So I think that the short answer is, and I'm sure it's more complicated if you got in the system, but it looks like the 35% of the settlement money should be going directly to local units of government over the period of the payout, and then the state's going to have control of the other amount. And I think that I recall that there's some percentage at 35% that the local units could actually use for non-opioid kinds of things. So my understanding is 1193 was considered a big improvement by the local units, and more are opting in now because they at least have a guarantee of getting some amount of that. And then I'm sure there'll be a little bit of a debate about how the state's going to be utilizing its share of the money.
Sonia, I just want to say thank you and goodbye. I have to jump off, but I'll use the remaining 30 seconds just to say thank you. Thank you to your engagement over the last few months And I hope to hear from everyone as we prepare for 2023. I'd love to hear from you regarding what your budgetary requests would be for the next 2 years, as well as some legislation that you would like to see filed. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much for coming today, and enjoy the rest of your day. Okay. So everything's on Representative Pierce's shoulders now. As far as, do we have any additional questions in the queue?
We have one additional question.
Okay.
Pamela Davidson, please unmute and ask your question.
Good morning, Matt. Thanks to you and Shelley for what you endure at the State House every day for us. It must be overwhelming. My question's about voter registration. We've just seen the mayhem in Texas, where 18% of people were thrown out of the rolls because of failure to sign the form where it was indicated. A few years ago, our Republican Secretary of State threw 400,000 Hoosiers off the voting rolls. That went to court. She lost. Were those people ever put back on? Who the hey knows? Republicans all over the country are assaulting our voter rights. So I'm very worried about that because Indiana, you talked about the absentee ballot fight back, but we have challenges other than that. Any insight for what the Dems can do? Because nationally, it doesn't look like it's going to happen. So we need some relief to make sure there's a robust voter registration instead of suppression as it is nationally. Thanks, Matt.
Thank you.
Well, you know, we've kind of been lucky here in Indiana in that we haven't seen a lot of the super draconian things you've seen happening in the southern states, although we have had some efforts here or there to try to make it a little harder to vote. And so I guess that's the good news. The bad news is there's no energy within the legislature to ask, how do we really get voter participation up? Because, you know, we are like pretty much at the bottom of the barrel for voter participation, for turnout. Now, there was a big bump last time, and so the Republicans, well, look at that. We had this big increase, so it can't be as bad as you Democrats complain about. But when you compare us to the bump up in the rest of the states, we're at the bottom of the barrel with the bump up. So, you know, the bottom line is the thing that I don't understand is this absolute fear of voting by mail. I mean, and I think this is a Trump side effect, but, you know, there are people basically don't want any voting by mail. And they've been trying to figure out ways to reduce that down. They think it gives Democrats an advantage, which the data shows it doesn't. Republicans like to vote by mail just as much as Democrats. And of course, it's interesting to me that the governor and the Republicans had no problem allowing anyone to vote by mail that wanted to during the COVID primary, in which it was a primary. So there was no chance for it to affect Republicans getting defeated by Democrats. But once we got past the primary and then we had the general election, with COVID going crazy, then it was like, oh no, we can't do it. So I think that tells you like all you need to know about that. But the frustration is we should just have voting by mail. You look out at Oregon, Washington State, Colorado. I talk to people who vote there and they love it. The ballot gets sent to their home. They sit down in the quiet of their home. They look at the ballot. When they see something about a candidate, like who's this candidate, they go look it up. They do some research and then they vote and they mail it in. And it's not a problem.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Representative Pierce. Do we have any additional questions in the queue?
I believe that Jim or Tommy, Allison, want to ask a question. Jim or Tommy, could you unmute and ask your question?
Yes, this is Tommy. And in regard to the dark money, the federal legislation, the Freedom to Vote Act, included the requirement for transparency in campaign donations. Would that help to follow the money in Indiana if we ever got it passed?
Yeah, I mean, that's a frustrating thing. So the Court and Citizens United said like, oh, you know, the legislature or the Congress can require people who contribute to 501c4s, which is a big conduit for this dark money. I mean, you could require that, you know, those donations be reported. So then you could follow the money. But, you know, Congress has not been able to pass that provision. So I think that would be really helpful if you could be sure that all these entities that are basically the conduit for this dark money had to report who's giving them the money, and then you could begin to see the flow of things. And so I think that would be a really big advantage as far as transparency.
Thank you, Representative Pierce. So has anyone else stepped up, Ms. Moderator?
No, we have no more questions in the chat at this time.
Well, lest you think you're getting off the hook, Representative Pierce, we actually have prepared in advance some additional questions. And the first question has to do with summer study committees. We're just wondering if you could kind of tell us how they work and what kinds of committees are in place for the summer.
This is a really interesting topic, and if you're not careful, I'm going to go 30 minutes on it. There was a really big change. Legislation passed probably maybe 10 years ago already that changed the summer study system. And what they overall were trying to do is it used to be that you would create a specific committee to look at a specific problem, and then legislators that had an interest in that would fight to get on that committee. Then they decided it would make more sense to have the people who served during the legislature, during the session, on standing committees that would actually end up considering legislation about the topic. It would make more sense to have them be the ones who serve on the interim study committee. So what they've essentially tried to do is set it up so that most of the study committees are like the House Health Committee members and the Senate Health Committee members, or at least, subset of those, or House Utilities and Senate Utilities. And so that was the first thing they did. The second thing they did is they took away the discretion of the committee chairs of the study committee to add topics. So the chair of study committees alternates back and forth between the House and the Senate. And so whoever's chairing that committee in the old days, they could say, oh, I'm the chair of the interim study committee on elections, and I want to talk about dark money, so I'm going to put that on the agenda, and we're going to have some people testify about it. Well, now they are absolutely forbidden from adding any topics unless they get approval from the four leaders, the four caucus leaders. And so they're really trying to constrict what can be done there. So the way the process works is there are a couple of pathways to getting an interim study committee, but all those pathways lead to the four leaders. So even if you pass a law, like a lot of times we'll say, we passed a law saying there's going to be a study committee on this topic, and the governor won't sign this law. Well, if you read the law carefully, all it says is that we encourage the legislative council, which is the leaders of the legislature, to actually study that topic. It doesn't actually mandate it. Now, if you create a task force, if you call it a task force and have the governor appoint some members too, then that's a mandate that has to happen when you write a bill that way. So what happens is at the end of the session, this resolution gets passed, which essentially says any idea, suggestion, or for a topic of a study committee, whether it's in a bill, in a resolution, in a letter to a leader, or scribbled on a cocktail napkin at a, in a steakhouse someplace, all those shall be forwarded to these four leaders, and then they vote. And so you have to get 3 out of 4 of those legislative leaders to say, yeah, this is a topic we're going to study. And then the next question is, do they send it to kind of one of these existing study committees, which has the standing committee members on it, or do you create a completely new committee and have new members appointed to look at it? So all of the ideas theoretically are in, although there's still a chance he could write some letters to get it under the wire. But probably in May, the Legislative Council, which is the leaders of the House and the Senate, will meet and they will vote on the list of topics. They'll basically pass their own resolution. And that's when you can see which topics have actually been chosen and which committees they've been assigned to. So stay tuned for that in May.
Okay, that's very helpful. We would like to know if you personally will be on any study committees or task forces that you are aware of at this point in time?
Yeah, I anticipate continuing to serve on the Energy Task Force. So this is like actually Energy Task Force 2. So we had 2 years in which we were supposed to be doing deep dives on, all these energy issues. And the decision was made by the Republican leadership that there's more to be done there. So we'll be in the second year of another 2-year round of energy study. It's been very frustrating because the co-chairs of the task force are really kind of controlling the testimony, what happens there. It's difficult. If you mention climate change, you're immediately told this is not about climate change. That's not what we're doing here. So that's a little bit frustrating. So I expect to be on that. I normally also serve on the interim study committee on courts and corrections, basically criminal code stuff, to continue working on criminal code reform. So those are the 2 main committees that I usually end up serving on.
Okay. We've also heard so much about the fact that there is undoubtedly going to be a special session, number one, to perhaps address Governor Holcomb's veto, or once a decision has been made by the Supreme Court on Roe versus Wade, that also may be cause for calling a general session or a special session, excuse me. And we were just wondering what's entailed in calling a special session, and does it require any kind of vote? What is that exactly is the process?
Yeah, so actually there's a little bit of confusion here. So back in 1995, the legislature passed a law creating something called a technical session day. So at that time in 95, when you would get to the end of the session, you would have hundreds of bills amending all parts of the code. And in many cases, you would have multiple bills amending the same section of law in different ways. So you'd have these conflicts. And so somehow they would have to be reconciled. And so the Legislative Services Agency would be very busy at the end of the session, running around, desperately doing these things called joint Rule 20 motions that basically kind of make everything sync up. And a lot of times they couldn't keep up with all the last minute changes and things going on. So in 95, they came up with this idea. It's like, okay, let's go ahead and just build into part of the session one day that meets after adjournment sine die. And on that technical correction day, you're only supposed to, now I say supposed to, you're only supposed to consider bills that make technical corrections, do this reconciliation stuff, and any veto overrides you might want to handle that day. So that day was set for May 24th, and that's the technical corrections day. So the legislature gets to do that on its own because it's in the statute. Now, normally what happens is they set that May 24th day and they tell you, hold that on your calendar, but we may very well cancel it. And there are many years where they say, we don't really need it. The conflicts we have, we can fix those up in the next session. And there are no vetoes that have been made, or the vetoes that were made by the governor are not that earth shattering that we have to rush in and deal, that we can wait until later. Because I think that the Constitution has been interpreted to say that you must vote on an override motion on a veto, which I think is different in Congress, where they can decide we don't want to try to override it. So that's a technical corrections day. So when the governor vetoed the transgender girl sports bill, immediately the leadership said, we are going to vote to override this veto on the technical correction day. And so that's going to happen, I'm fairly certain, on May 24th. And they could also choose to vote on the other override if they wanted to on that day as well. So that kind of deals with technical corrections and the vetoes. Now, there is some discussion amongst the Republicans about, well, if the U.S. Supreme Court were to override Roe v. Wade, then we would want to immediately make abortion illegal. And so we would need to have a special session to do that. In this case, that would be up to Governor Holcomb, because our Constitution gives the governor the sole power to call the legislature into session when the legislature has not otherwise set up its schedule through a statute, through passing a law. So what that essentially means is is if the U.S. Supreme Court were to overrule Roe v. Wade, it would be up to the governor to decide whether he would want to have an immediate special session to pass legislation to make abortion illegal in the state, or whether he would just sit back and have the legislature have to wait until Organization Day in November, which is 2 weeks after Election Day, to do any kind of legislating. So that's going to be completely in the hands of the governor.
Do you have any feel for whether he's likely to do that?
You know, it's hard to know because I can't quite figure out whether the governor is thinking, has the mindset of like, okay, I've served my 2 terms as governor and now I'm going to transition to a non-political life and go work for a corporation or something, or whether he's thinking of running for something else, because there's all kinds of rumors churning around that Senator Braun wants to come back and run for governor instead of running for re-election to the Senate. You might recall that before all the crazy twists and turns of his political career, Governor Holcomb was trying to get elected to the U.S. Senate. And then you had the thing where he became the lieutenant governor when the last lieutenant governor left, and then Pence became the VP candidate, so then he became the governor's candidate. So looking at what he's done so hard, it's kind of hard to figure out, because when he vetoed the transgender sports bill, that was kind of an indication to me that he wasn't too worried about these primary voters who are going to determine his fate in any future election to get a Republican nomination. And so I thought, like, okay, that's an indication that he's moving on to something else. But then he signed the gun permit bill after his own superintendent of the state police had viciously attacked people for backing the bill for political purposes. And usually you don't have your members of your administration go out and make really, pointed comments like that unless you're kind of backing them up. So I think he must have decided, it appears, that if I want to have any political future at all in the Republican Party, I can't be double-crossing the Second Amendment crowd. So I don't have a good sense for what's going on there. I would say that if he's thinking he wants to run for future office in Indiana, which would require him to get the Republican nomination, I think the pressure will be extremely great on him to call that special session. And I think that if he thinks that one day I might run for something, I suspect he probably will call it. But this is all speculation.
Well, all of it is very informative. First of all, getting that clarification between the technical session and the special session. I had never realized those 2 differences. So I thank you for that and for trying to give us some insight into what Governor Holcomb might be thinking. We're just wondering, what are your thoughts about preparing for the long session that will be coming next year? What kinds of things do you have on your mind that you think you may be taking up as a cause during that session?
Well, I think that, it'll be a budget year. And so to me, the budget priorities is the biggest thing. And, that's a whole nother discussion, which I couldn't quite get to, so maybe I'll talk a little bit about that now, is, year in and year out, when we've done these, or every 2 years, when we've done these biennial budgets, when Democrats have come forward and said, like, here's a need we really need to meet. Like, why don't we just pay for school textbooks? Parents are paying, and families, hundreds of dollars for textbooks. Let's take the burden off working families and do what almost every other state does. Let's just pay for the textbooks. And they'll say, like, oh, that's 60, 80, $100 million a year fiscal impact. We can't afford it. Gee, we'd like to do it. We just can't afford it. And then you'd ask me, well, let's do something on childcare. Okay, let's actually make it really available, not just kind of available across the state. And it's like, well, that would be really nice, but we have to be fiscally responsible, and we just don't have the money. And that would be the answer to every attempt to expand help for Hoosier families. Well, at the end of the last budget session, you might recall, there was so much money gushing in because the federal government was shipping us all kinds of money for COVID. They had stimulated the economy greatly, with all these stimulus checks, where people were out buying stuff. And so sales tax was like through the roof. And there was so much money that they were trying to figure out like ways to hide it. It's like, okay, let's say this is dedicated to this pension fund over here. and let's like park that over there. And they were trying to figure out how to kind of make it look like they had less money than they really did. Representative Delaney made a quip that, you know, basically they were out hiding the money in coffee cans and burying it under trees in the State House lawn. It had gotten so ridiculous. And it finally got to the point, because you might recall, for example, the governor's task force said that you needed like $600 million or something to be able to address teacher pay and really begin to get teacher pay up. And there was like zero interest in doing that. But when we got into that last week of the session, there were billions of dollars stacked to the ceiling of the State House, and we were kind of beating them up. And so finally they said, like, we don't have any excuses left. And so they put money in for teacher raises. They funded a lot of stuff that they were cutting. And it was just a complete turnaround. And it became a budget that was so good because there was so much money gushing in that something had happened for the first time in my career. Basically, these budgets were passing unanimously. These were bipartisan, broadly supported budgets because they were finally addressing a lot of the needs of the state. So I think the Republicans who don't like government, they don't like government programs, they think government should be as small and do as little as possible. They're trying to figure out, how do we get rid of this money so we don't have another situation where we have so much money in the Treasury that we can't use fiscal responsibility as an excuse not to fund stuff. We just have to say, as a matter of policy, we don't like this program. See, that's what they want to avoid. They don't want to look Hoosiers in the eye and say, we don't think government should have anything to do with childcare, and we don't want to do these programs. Instead, they say, well, we got just enough to do a little bit, but sorry, we can't do something really big. And so when the money's there, it takes away that built-in excuse. And so this tax cut, even though it's got all these weird triggers in it, there has to be enough growth in the money coming in to trigger these future cuts. So it's a little bit squirrely in how it might work. But I think that, you know, this is going to be kind of the big debate, I think, for the next session is, do you basically just drain the Treasury with a lot of automatic tax refunds, other types of refunds, or do you say we finally have enough resources we can begin to address real problems, like we talked about mental health? You know, what if we built mental health facilities, regional facilities throughout the state? What if we hired the professionals to actually deal with addiction treatment and mental health treatment? We have those facilities. It's like, what if we actually had places for homeless to deal with all that? I mean, there are a lot of things that you could do, but, you know, they're just the Republicans that are in charge now, their kind of philosophy or ideology is just not built for that, because they truly believe that, you know, the bigger government gets, the more borders you have, the worse it is. And they don't want to go down that path. So to me, that's going to be the big issue for the upcoming session.
Thank you so much for giving us some insight into that. And we have about 7 minutes left, and we usually give you and Senator Yoder an opportunity to make some closing remarks. And so I would kind of turn it over to you to say, do you have any closing remarks that you'd like to make for us?
Well, I do want to thank the League of Women Voters for organizing these discussions. I think they're really good. I mean, one of the frustrations that I have is, you know, just the current state of the media in general, whether it's our own local newspaper trying to, you know, survive, is made it really difficult, I think, for people, you know, that are used to relying upon traditional media to understand what's happening at the State House. And it's kind of devolved into this kind of fragmented social media world. So it's really important that you've given us this opportunity to come together from time to time and people to kind of hear directly what's happening, because the normal process that as a legislator that I used to have of being able to kind of inform people through the newspaper is really pretty much evaporated. And, you know, broadcast news is not really focused in on politics. It doesn't get ratings. So this is kind of an important thing. So I appreciate it. And thank you for that. I guess I would end on kind of a couple happy notes. So some good things that happened that I've been working on for a long time and have not really gotten much attention at all is we were able to get stuck into one of the other economic development bills, film development tax credits. I don't know if I talked about this in a previous meeting or not, but the way the film industry works is if you want to make a movie, you have to go to Hollywood or someplace and get the financing. And when you go out there, they'll ask, well, where are you actually going to shoot the film? Right. And a lot of times we've had filmmakers from Indiana, in our own community. We have, Angelo Pizzo did Hoosiers. He's filmed a number of movies in Indiana. Well, now when he and others like him go out and say, we want to shoot this movie in Indiana, the first thing they ask is like, well, what kind of tax credits do they have for film production, for media production in the state? And when they're told, well, Indiana doesn't have anything, then they say like, well, we're not going to finance a film in which there aren't any tax credits. So we'll go to Georgia or Illinois or some other place. And so we've missed out on an opportunity for people to have film production jobs and kind of develop that industry in the state. So we now have in the law a provision that allows for up to a 30% tax credit, and it's going to be administered by the Indiana Economic Development Corporation, the IEDC, that you all know, kind of economic development subsidy kind of stuff. And so it'll be interesting to see how that is actually administered, whether it's well promoted, and whether that actually shifts production into the state. And I think it's been maddening. There have been a number of books that are set in Indiana, and then when it's time to film them as movies, they can't do it here. The financiers won't do it, and so it ends up getting shot in Pittsburgh, and they like try to make Pittsburgh stand in for Indianapolis, which is a little bit strange. So there are real opportunities there. So that's a big thing that happened. And that, I mean, literally years and years and years been working on that. Another thing that we got into the law is caps on the charges for inmates making calls, whether they're in the jail or at DOC. And so this is an example of how you can have an effect in the minority, but you just got to know how to work it, right? So last year, I introduced this legislation that said that the state must follow for in-state phone calls coming out of jails and the Department of Corrections, the caps on rates put in place for calls between states by the Federal Communications Commission. Because the FCC wrote all the states and said, we only have legal authority over calls that go from one state to another state. We can't regulate the calls within a state like Indiana. And we have all these regulations about what jails and prisons can charge for inmates making calls that go outside the state, but you have to handle it in state. So I introduced a bill that would have said a year ago that the jails and DOC must follow the interstate rate caps for in-state calls. And that bill got assigned to the Utilities Committee, on which I serve, which I hadn't anticipated. I thought it would go to the Courts Committee, which I also serve on. And I could not get the chair of the committee to hear that bill. He just had no interest in it. So this year, this last session comes up, I said, okay, I got to take a different path. So instead of introducing the bill, I went to the chair of the House Courts Committee, Courts and Criminal Code Committee, and I said, look, this is what I'm trying to accomplish. And I explained to her the impact of this, because what had happened over time is often the contractors who provide the phone services would provide a kickback to the jail in exchange for being able to charge high rates. And so you had a situation where big, calls would be monstrously expensive, and the inmates couldn't afford to call their own family members. And little kids whose parents are in jail, they couldn't afford to talk to them. And so this had real negative impacts. And part of it's because they were building into the rates this kind of revenue sharing with the facilities in order to get the contract. So I explained this to the chair of the Courts Committee, and I said, look, I want us to find a bill that's somewhat related to DOC or incarceration or something. I want to put this provision in a bill. Will you help me on that? And she said it made sense. And so she identified, she said, yeah, put it in this bill. And so we did that in committee, and it just moved along very smoothly. No one challenged it or said it was a bad thing, and it's gotten signed into law. So there'll be some relief there. So that's just, one example of how, if you hang around that building long enough, you'll recognize that there are multiple pathways to make something happen, and you just got to get the key people on the pathway to do it. And the other thing too is sometimes if you make it a democratic initiative, you have problems. And so one of the things I did is I just made sure to keep my fingerprints off of it as much as possible. Once I got it kind of hooked up to the train leaving the station, then I just kind of, sat back and monitored its progress. And now it's law today. So that's a good thing.
Well, we give you kudos for that. And I know that we feel very fortunate to have you there working for the citizens that you represent. And one of the things that I just can't thank you enough for is taking the time to participate in these updates and actually talking with us and giving us an opportunity to know you. And certainly we appreciate that from Senator Yoder as well. You give us so much insight into the actual workings of the Indiana General Assembly. And just in closing, not only to thank you, but I also want to thank everyone who attended these sessions, whether you attended one or all three. We are just so grateful to be able to have this opportunity to let you get to know your legislators and what they're doing and how complex their jobs are, particularly if they are in the minority. Don't forget that next year's legislative session includes budgeting, as Representative Pierce has pointed out to us, and it will be a long session from January through April. Make sure that you continue to check on legislation at iga.in.gov. Seeing not only how your legislators voted in this legislative session that just ended, but also to see what's coming up next session. A follow-up email is going to be sent to all of you, and it will remind you of just some basics about remembering to vote in the primary election on May 3rd. And we will actually have a voter information sheet for you to kind of guide you through anything that you might want to check on with reference to your own personal registration. We want to make sure each one of you doesn't miss an opportunity to participate in the process. And the most important part of that process is taking the time to vote. I want to thank all of our team members. I certainly hope you know that I don't do this on my own. Not only do we have our our question moderator and our timer involved, but we also have many other members of both the Bloomington Monroe County League and the Brown County League working behind the scenes to prepare us for these forums that we're able to host. We also appreciate so much community access television services and both of the chambers of commerce from Brown County and Greater Bloomington. So stay active, stay involved. We want all of you to continue to be informed voters, and participation in this kind of forum is just key to something like that. We also hope you'll encourage other individuals to be involved in this way and in any other way. Reach out to the leagues if there's any other questions or anything we can ever do for you to help you make sure that your vote counts. Thank you again, and we look forward to the session next year to hopefully have additional updates for you and have the interaction that's necessary for a fair democracy. Thank you all. Have a great rest of your Saturday. Bye-bye.